It was 11 p.m. in Columbus, Ohio, when someone started knocking on my front door like they already knew I was awake. And honestly, I was. I don't sleep well when numbers don't make sense. When I opened the door, I didn't expect to see Melissa Carter, my son Evan's former partner, standing there soaked from the rain, shaking like she had just run out of time. And the first thing she said wasn't hello. It was, "You need to know what Evan did with your money." I've spent 30 years reading financial lies for a living. But that sentence, that one felt personal. And here's the strange part. I didn't even ask her to repeat it. I just stepped aside and let her in. I should have ignored that knock, but I didn't. If you're watching this, I'm curious, what country are you from and what time is it where you are right now? And if stories like this pull you in the way they pulled me back into that night, consider subscribing. You might want to hear how this one unravels. I live in a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. The kind of place where people wave at each other even if they don't remember your name. My house is a 2-story brick build from the late 90s, slightly faded red with a front porch that creaks in the winter, and a mailbox that leans a little to the left, like it's tired of life. My name is Alaric Powell, 67 years old, retired forensic accountant, which is a polite way of saying I spent most of my life digging through financial messes that other people swore didn't exist. And before you ask, yes, I still do it in my head. Some habits don't retire just because your paycheck does. That night after I let Melissa Carter into my house, I closed the door slowly. Not because I was scared. I don't scare easily. It was more like I was giving the moment time to settle in like dust after something heavy falls. Melissa stood in my hallway dripping water onto the wooden floorboards. I remember thinking that's going to stain. Then I caught myself and almost laughed. A woman shows up at 11 p.m. talking about my son stealing money. And my first concern is hardwood flooring. That's who I am. "Take your shoes off," I said calmly. She blinked at me like I had just offered her tea during a fire. "What shoes?" "Off." My wife used to yell at me about water damage. Old habits. That got a small broken laugh out of her. Not joy, just release. Like she hadn't used those muscles in a while. I led her into the kitchen. It's small with beige counters, a fridge that hums too loudly, and a coffee machine I refuse to replace, even though Frank Donovan keeps telling me it belongs in a museum. Frank, my best friend, 68 years old, former bank compliance officer, and the only man I know who can make sarcasm sound like a second language. Melissa sat down at the table like her legs had stopped negotiating with her brain. I made tea, Earl Grey, 2 sugars. My wife Helen used to say I made it wrong every time. She was probably right. So I said, placing the mug in front of her, "You drove through a storm at 11 p.m. to tell me my son stole money." She looked at me, eyes red, voice tight. "It's worse than that." I didn't respond immediately. I've learned something over the years. People reveal more. When you don't rush to fill silence. Silence makes truth uncomfortable enough to come out on its own. Melissa pulled a damp folder from her bag. It was slightly bent edges, soft from being handled too many times. She placed it on my table like it weighed more than paper should. "This is only part of it," she said. I opened it. Now here's something you need to understand about me. I don't read documents like normal people. I don't skim. I don't jump to conclusions. I scan patterns, flows, timing gaps, repeated anomalies. Frank always jokes that I don't read paper, I interrogate it. The first page showed loan agreements, names I didn't recognize. But then I saw something that made my fingers pause. My name, Alaric Powell, used as a reference guarantor. I leaned back slightly, not shocked, not angry yet, just interested. "You're sure this is real?" I asked. Melissa let out a bitter laugh. I wish it wasn't. I flipped to the next page, and the next. Transactions, structured transfers, layers of movement designed to hide origin points, the kind of thing you don't accidentally do. You plan it, or you're told exactly how to do it. $18,750, $42,300, $250,000, different dates, different accounts, same pattern. And the pattern, that's where my brain started to wake up. Because patterns don't lie. People do. I set the folder down slowly. Evan didn't do this alone, I said. Melissa shook her head. He thinks he did. That line stayed with me longer than I expected. Because arrogance is a strange thing. It convinces people they're the authors of stories that already have other writers. I stood up and walked to the sink, not because I needed water, but because movement helps me think. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead. Outside, the rain hit the window in soft, uneven bursts. Melissa spoke again, quieter this time. He kept saying it was temporary leverage, that everything would balance out once his startup scaled. I almost smiled at that. Everyone who loses money says temporary at some point. It's like financial denial is universal language. That got another small laugh from her, short, painful. I turned back. Where is Evan now? Chicago. Of course, always Chicago. Big enough city to disappear in, small enough to think you're still visible. I picked up the folder again, flipping past pages faster now. My pace changed. That's usually how people can tell I've shifted from observation to investigation. Melissa noticed. You're seeing it, aren't you? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because I was seeing something else too, not just fraud, desperation. Bad decisions rarely start as crimes. They start as shortcuts. Then she said something that changed the temperature of the room. He used your old credentials, Alaric. I stopped. That part wasn't in the documents yet. That was spoken information. The kind that sits outside paperwork, but inside consequences. My old credentials, I repeated. She nodded. From your consulting work. He said you wouldn't mind, that you were retired anyway. I let out a slow breath through my nose. Retirement. That word. People think it means disconnect. It doesn't. It just means you stop getting paid to care. But caring, that doesn't stop. I sat down again. Frank is going to love this, I muttered. Melissa frowned. Who's Frank? My best friend, retired banker. Also the only man alive who can smell bad accounting from across a parking lot. That earned a real laugh this time. Small but real. For a moment the room felt less heavy. Then my phone buzzed on the table, a message from Evan Powell. Everything is fine, Dad. Busy week. Talk soon. I stared at it. Melissa saw my expression change. He sent that tonight. Yeah, I said quietly. About an hour before you knocked. Now here's the thing I need you to understand. There are coincidences in life, and then there are timing patterns that feel like someone rehearsed them. This felt like the second one. I set the phone down face first. Finish your tea, I said. Melissa blinked. What you drove through a storm. You're shaking. And you're about to tell me everything you're too afraid to say out loud. She hesitated. Then she nodded. And that's when she pulled out the second folder. The one I didn't know existed yet. And I realized something very clearly in that moment. This wasn't just about money. This was about how far my son had already fallen without me noticing. And I was about to find out exactly how deep it went. You know what people don't tell you about silence? It doesn't just fill a room. It starts rewriting it. After Melissa handed me that second folder, I didn't open it immediately. I just sat there, fingers resting on the edge of the table, watching the rain slide down my kitchen window like it had nowhere else to go either. Melissa was staring at me like she expected an explosion, anger, panic, something loud. I gave her none of that. Because in my line of work, loud emotions usually mean you've already lost control. I need water, I said finally. She blinked. Water. Hydration helps decision-making. Or at least it makes bad decisions feel slightly more organized. That got a confused laugh out of her. Not the reaction she expected at 11:30 p.m. after accusing someone's son of financial fraud. I stood up, grabbed 2 glasses from the cabinet, filled them, and placed one in front of her. Then I sat back down. Only then did I open the second folder. Inside were screenshots, email chains, bank transfer confirmations, a few text messages between Evan and someone saved only as NH. I didn't know that name yet, but I didn't like it already. Melissa leaned forward. That's his investor contact, or at least that's what he called him. I scanned the emails slowly, not reading them like stories, breaking them apart like equations. Something about them felt off immediately. Not illegal at first glance, no obvious theft, no screaming red flags. That's what made it dangerous. Because real financial manipulation rarely looks like crime at first. It looks like optimism with paperwork. Then I saw it. A pattern of transfers always routed through 3 steps. Never direct, always layered, always delayed by exactly 48 to 72 hours. I leaned back slightly. "You see this?" I asked quietly. Melissa nodded quickly. "I don't understand it, but yes. That's what I've been trying to tell people." "No," I said. "You don't understand how precise this is." She frowned. "Precise." I tapped the page with one finger. Nobody accidentally builds a 3-layer transfer system with consistent delay intervals. This is structured, controlled. A pause. Then I added softer. Either Evan is smarter than I thought, or he's being guided by someone who is. That sentence changed her expression, because it removed the idea of a simple mistake and replaced it with something worse. Design. I stood up again and walked into my living room. Frank's voice message from earlier was still on my phone, waiting to be listened to. I hadn't touched it yet. Melissa followed me with her eyes but didn't move. I called Frank. He picked up after 2 rings. "Alaric, if you're calling me this late, either someone died or you finally figured out how to use social media. I need you to come over," I said. A pause. Oh, he said. That tone means money is involved. Worse. Another pause. Family, money. I looked at Melissa briefly. Yes. Frank sighed like a man accepting a weather forecast he didn't order. "Give me 20 minutes. I'll bring donuts. If I'm going to suffer, I want sugar." He hung up. I turned back to Melissa. "He's coming." She looked relieved and terrified at the same time. "Is he like you?" "No," I said. "He's worse. He laughs more." That actually made her relax a little. For a few minutes, the house was quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. This one had weight, like something had already been set in motion. I used the time to go back to the emails, and that's when I noticed something I almost missed. A recurring phrase, temporary bridge financing, over and over. Different dates, different amounts, same wording. That phrase is dangerous in finance. It sounds harmless. It sounds like someone will fix it later. But in reality, it's often what people say right before they stop fixing anything at all. Melissa spoke quietly from behind me. He started changing after the startup pitch in January. He stopped sleeping, started drinking more coffee than food. Then he met that investor group. What investor group, I asked without looking up. She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "The Northbridge Circle," she said. I stopped scrolling. Not because the name meant something to her, but because it meant something to me. I had seen it once before, years ago, in a completely unrelated audit case involving offshore shell companies and artificially inflated startup valuations. Back then, it was just a footnote in a report that got buried, but I remembered it. Because people like me don't forget patterns that almost escaped accountability. Frank arrived exactly 19 minutes later. Of course he did. He walked in wearing a rain jacket, holding a paper bag, and immediately looked at Melissa. "Oh," he said. "We have a late-night plot twist." "Frank," I said, "focus." He held up a donut. "I am focused. I'm holding morale support." Melissa gave a small, exhausted smile. Frank sat down, looked at the folders, and whistled softly. That's a lot of paperwork for a man who was supposed to be retired and watching birds. I don't watch birds, I said. You absolutely do, he replied. I ignored him. Frank flipped through a few pages. Then his expression changed slightly, not shock, recognition. That name, he said, tapping the page. Northbridge, I've seen that before. I nodded. So have I. Frank looked up at me. This is not small Alaric. No, I said. It's structured. Melissa looked between us. What does that mean? Frank answered this time. It means your boyfriend's former boyfriend didn't just mess up. He stepped into something already built to catch people like him. That line landed heavily, because it removed the illusion of randomness completely. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time that night I felt something colder than anger. Clarity. This is bigger than Evan, I said quietly. Frank nodded once. Usually is. Melissa whispered, Then what do we do? I looked at the rain outside again, and I realized something I didn't want to admit out loud yet. We weren't chasing a mistake anymore. We were chasing a system, and systems don't collapse easily. They fight back. I stood up. First, I said we find out exactly how deep my son is inside it. Frank took a bite of his donut, and second, I paused, then answered second. We find out who taught him how to build it. And somewhere in Chicago, Evan Powell was still texting me saying everything was fine. But I already knew that was the most expensive lie in the entire story. Frank always says the truth doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It arrives like a draft under a door you didn't notice was open. And that night around 1:12 a.m., it arrived in the form of Melissa Carter, standing up so suddenly her chair scraped against my kitchen floor. I need to show you something else, she said. Her voice had changed, not louder, not panicked, more like she had finally stopped negotiating with fear. I looked at Frank. He raised his eyebrows like, Don't ask me. I just brought donuts and bad timing. Melissa reached into her bag again. This time, she didn't pull out a folder. She pulled out a USB drive. That's when I felt it. Not alarm, not surprise. Shift in probability. People don't carry USB drives at 11 p.m. unless they've already decided the conversation is going to end differently than it started. What is that? I asked. Melissa swallowed. Backups, screenshots, audio files. Evan didn't know I kept copies. Frank let out a low whistle. Oh, I like her. She prepares for emotional lawsuits. Melissa didn't smile this time. She handed me the USB. I didn't take it immediately. I just studied her face. You understand, I said slowly, once I open this, you can't go back to not knowing things. She nodded. I already passed that point. That answer told me more about her than anything in the folders. Frank leaned forward. Do we have a computer for this, or are we doing ancient rituals? I stood up and walked to my study. Old room. Books I don't read anymore. A desk that still smells faintly like printer ink and deadlines. I plugged in my old Dell Latitude. Frank immediately groaned. That thing looks like it survived the Obama administration. It did, I said. And so did most of my career decisions. Melissa stood behind me. Frank pulled a chair closer. The USB opened slowly. Too slowly. Frank tapped the desk. Even your files load like they're thinking about retirement. Then the first folder appeared. Evan/Northbridge Communications. I clicked. Emails, internal notes, meeting summaries, then audio files. Melissa leaned in. Play that one. I hesitated for half a second, then clicked play. A male voice filled the room. Confident, controlled, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly. Evan. Not the Evan I knew as a child asking me why receipts mattered. This Evan was sharper, faster, detached. We don't need full transparency, his voice said. We just need them to believe it's temporary exposure. Frank frowned. That's not normal startup talk. I said nothing. The audio continued. Another voice joined in, older, calm, measured. "You're over-leveraging trust," the second voice said. A pause. Then Evan again. "Trust is just delayed skepticism." Frank looked at me. "Did your son just redefine fraud philosophy?" I didn't answer, because I was no longer listening to words. I was listening to structure, tone shifts, timing gaps, authority dynamics. And what I was hearing made something very clear. Evan was not the architect. He was a participant trying very hard to sound like one. Melissa spoke quietly. "That second voice, that's him." "Who?" Frank asked. "The investor, the one Evan calls NH." I leaned closer to the screen. Another file. Northbridge Master Plan .pdf. I opened it. And there it was, a network diagram. Not just accounts, not just transfers. A system of controlled financial movement designed like a maze that always leads back to someone else's liability. Frank exhaled slowly. "This is not amateur hour." "No," I said quietly, "this is institutional." Melissa's hands were shaking now. "So Evan isn't just in trouble." I closed the file. That's the moment I remember most clearly from that night. Not anger, not panic, just understanding. "He's inside something that already existed before he joined it," I said. Frank leaned back. "And now we get to the fun part, extracting him before the structure collapses on him." Melissa whispered, "Can it collapse?" I looked at her. "Yes," I said, "but not cleanly." The room went quiet again. Even Frank stopped joking. Outside rain kept hitting the windows in steady rhythm. It sounded almost polite compared to what was happening inside my head. I stood up. "I need coffee," I said. Frank blinked. "You've had tea, donuts, and emotional trauma. Coffee is where you draw the line." "Yes," I said. "Coffee is where I regain moral authority." Melissa gave a short, tired laugh. For a moment, the room felt almost human again. Then my phone buzzed. "Evan." Another message. "Evan Powell, Dad. I might need your old consulting advice. Something came up with funding paperwork." Frank saw it over my shoulder. "Oh, that's adorable. He's asking for help while standing in a burning building." Melissa stiffened. "He sent that just now." "Yeah," I said. Frank leaned forward. "Reply." I stared at the message. There was a time when I would have answered immediately, explained things, cleaned up messes, fixed numbers until they behaved, but this wasn't numbers anymore. This was consequences. "No," I said finally. Melissa looked shocked. "You're not going to answer him." I shook my head slightly. "Not yet." That answer changed the air again. Frank studied me. "You're planning something." "I'm observing," I corrected, but that wasn't entirely true, because I had already started mapping the next steps. And in my line of work, observation is just the first stage of intervention. Melissa sat down slowly. "What happens if he finds out we know I looked at her?" And for the first time that night, I didn't soften my voice. "Then he stops controlling the story," I said. Frank nodded slowly. "And whoever is behind him notices we're reading their script." A long silence followed. Then Frank added almost casually, "So basically we just stepped into a room where nobody invited us, and we're reading the private notes out loud." I sighed. "That's one way to put it." Melissa looked down at her hands. "I didn't want this to go this far." I believed her. People rarely want things to go this far. They just underestimate how far things can go. I closed the laptop. "Okay," I said. "We do this properly now." Frank smirked slightly. "Define properly." "We trace everything I said, every transfer, every credential, every decision Evan made," Melissa whispered. And then I looked at her. "Then we find the point where he stopped being in control." A pause. Frank nodded. "And we cut the system there." Outside, the rain finally started to slow. But inside that room, something had already accelerated. And none of us, not even me, fully understood. Yet how many people were already connected to the thing we had just opened? Morning in Ohio doesn't really arrive so much as it just replaces the night without asking permission. By 6:48 a.m., the rain was gone, the sky looked too clean to trust, and my kitchen felt like it had aged 5 years in one conversation. Frank had fallen asleep in my recliner with a donut still in his hand. Melissa was sitting at the table staring at her phone like it might confess something on its own. And me, I was already halfway through rebuilding a financial map of my son's life on my old laptop. That's what people don't understand about someone like me. We don't panic. We reconstruct. Melissa finally spoke. I didn't sleep. Frank, without opening his eyes, muttered, "Welcome to the club. We don't have jackets." I didn't smile, not because it wasn't funny, but because I was looking at something that stopped being funny about 3 hours earlier. A transfer chain. $18,750 to Shell account. In Delaware, $42,300 to Intermediary LLC in Illinois. $250,000 to offshore linked holding structure. All of it circling one name, Northbridge Holdings LLC. And the most disturbing part, every path eventually touched something that had my old consulting credentials embedded in it. Frank sat up slowly, rubbing his face. Please tell me I'm still dreaming and not financially adopted into a crime documentary. I wish I said. Melissa leaned forward. What did you find? I turned the laptop slightly toward her. You said Evan used my credentials, I said. You were right, but not how you think. Frank frowned. Oh, I already don't like where this sentence is going. I tapped the screen. These aren't just access logs. These are authorization signatures. Whoever built this system didn't just want money moving. They wanted it to look like it was moving under legitimate professional oversight. Melissa went pale. Meaning, I looked at her. Meaning my name isn't just involved, I said quietly. It's been used as structural cover. Silence. Even Frank stopped moving. That's the kind of silence that changes temperature. Melissa whispered. So they're using you as protection. Yes, I said. Frank leaned back. That's bold. Criminals usually don't borrow retired accountants for aesthetic purposes. They don't, I replied, unless they trust the signature more than the person. That line stayed in the air longer than it should have. Melissa suddenly stood up. Evan didn't tell me any of this. He said it was just funding pressure, that it was normal startup chaos. I looked at her. That's how it always starts, I said. Frank pointed at the screen. Okay, serious question. If your name is in this system, can we remove it? I didn't answer immediately because the honest answer wasn't simple. We can't remove it, I said finally. We can only prove it wasn't controlled by me. Frank exhaled. So basically we're entering the prove a negative in federal financial structures phase. My favorite. Melissa rubbed her temples. So what do we do first? I closed the laptop. That depends, I said. On what Frank asked. On whether Evan knows he's inside a system or thinks he built it. That distinction matters more than people realize. Frank stood up, stretched, and walked to the kitchen. I'm making coffee. If we're going to dismantle financial architecture, I need caffeine and emotional denial. Melissa followed him with her eyes. He's always like that. Yes, I said, but he's usually right. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, my neighbor was mowing his lawn like nothing in the world had changed overnight. That's America for you. Someone is always mowing grass while someone else is quietly discovering their family is entangled in something far larger than they understood. Melissa joined me at the window. He really didn't know she asked. I paused. I don't think Evan understands the difference between control and participation, I said. He thinks if he's in the room making decisions, he owns the outcome. Frank called from the kitchen. Spoiler, that's how you lose money and friendships. Melissa gave a small, tired smile, but then her phone rang. She looked at it and froze. Evan, she whispered. Frank immediately stopped pouring coffee. I turned. Answer it, I said. She hesitated. What do I say? Nothing you can't repeat later, I replied. She picked up. A pause. Then Evan's voice came through, faint but sharp. "Melissa, why are you not responding to my messages?" She looked at me. I nodded. "I've been busy," she said carefully. Another pause. Then Evan, slightly irritated, "Did you talk to my dad?" Frank mouthed, "Oh no." I stepped closer but didn't take the phone. Melissa kept going. "Evan, what is Northbridge holding silence on the line? Not the good kind. The kind where someone is deciding what version of reality to present." Then Evan laughed. Short, controlled, too controlled. "You don't need to worry about that," he said. "That sentence alone told me everything." Frank whispered, "That's the voice of someone who definitely needs to worry about that." Melissa tightened her grip on the phone. "It's using Alaric's credentials. Do you understand what that means?" Another pause. Then Evan's tone changed slightly. Lower. More careful. "Why are you with him right now? That question wasn't about logistics. It was about containment." I leaned in closer. Melissa looked at me, then spoke slowly. "Because I needed the truth." Evan exhaled sharply through the phone. "You should not have done that," Frank muttered. Oh, that's never a good sentence. I finally spoke loud enough for him to hear. "Evan." A pause. "Dad." His voice came through slightly unsettled now. I kept my tone calm, always calm. "How long has Northbridge been using my credentials?" I asked. Silence again. Longer this time. Then Evan replied carefully, "I didn't know they were using yours." Frank closed his eyes. Translation: he absolutely knew something was off. I continued, "Then explain why my signature appears in authorization logs I never approved." Evan didn't answer immediately. And that delay, that was the truth leaking through the cracks. Finally, "I thought it was standard compliance formatting," he said. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Every inexperienced participant in a system like this believes complexity equals legitimacy. Frank leaned toward me. He's lying or rationalizing. "Pick one." "Both," I said quietly. Melissa stepped back, overwhelmed. "Evan, this is serious." His voice sharpened slightly. "It's under control," he said again. That phrase again, control. The most overused illusion in financial collapse. I stepped closer to the phone. "No," I said calmly. "It isn't." Silence. And for the first time since this started, Evan didn't respond immediately. That told me more than any document ever could. Then he said something that changed the entire room. "Dad, don't escalate this." Frank immediately sat up. Melissa went pale. I didn't move, but I understood exactly what that meant. Because you don't tell someone not to escalate something unless escalation is already on the table somewhere else. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about recovering money. It was about stopping something already in motion, something Evan couldn't fully see, and something I was now directly inside. I looked at Frank. He nodded once. We both understood the same thing without speaking it. This wasn't the beginning of the investigation anymore. It was the beginning of the response. After Evan said, "Don't escalate this," nobody moved for a few seconds. Not me, not Melissa, not even Frank, which is unusual because Frank treats silence like it's a personal insult. The phone call had already ended. No goodbye, no clarification, just a clean disconnect like someone cutting a wire they didn't want traced. Frank finally broke it. "Well," he said slowly, that sounded like the exact phrase someone says right before things escalate. Melissa sat down again like her legs had simply stopped agreeing with her decisions. "I've never heard him sound like that," she whispered. I stayed standing by the window. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past like none of this existed. That's something I've always found strange, how normal the world insists on staying while your own quietly tilts off balance. Frank walked over and leaned against the counter. "So let me summarize," he said. "Your son is involved in something called Northbridge. Your name is in the authorization chain, and someone just told you not to escalate. Did I miss anything?" I nodded slightly. You forgot the part where they think I can be controlled. Frank snorted. Ah, my favorite part. Underestimating retired professionals. Melissa rubbed her arms. Evan wouldn't threaten you. I turned toward her. I didn't say he threatened me, I replied. I said he thinks escalation is something he can manage. Frank pointed at me. That's worse, by the way. We moved back to the table. The laptop was still open, the Northbridge files still sitting there like they had no intention of explaining themselves. I reopened Evan's communication logs. Frank leaned in. So what's the next move, Sherlock? I stopped thinking like a father? I said. That made Melissa flinch. Frank didn't. He just nodded once. Good. Because fathers forgive. Investigators don't. That was the moment something shifted in the room. Not emotionally, structurally. I started mapping Evan's behavior the way I used to map corporate fraud cases. Not as a person, as a sequence. Melissa watched me carefully. You're doing that thing again, she said. What thing? I asked. The way you stopped seeing him as your son. I paused. That's not what I'm doing, I said quietly. I'm separating identity from access points. Frank raised an eyebrow. That sounds emotionally terrifying and financially correct. I ignored him and continued. Evan's startup record showed a clear pattern now. Initial optimism, rapid funding expansion, then a tightening cycle of cash flow disguised as bridge financing. And then Northbridge appeared not as a source of funding, but as a structuring layer. The more I looked, the more it became obvious. Evan wasn't leading anything. He was being paced. Frank noticed what I was seeing. He's being guided. He said, yes, I replied. Melissa frowned. By who? That was the question, and I didn't have a full answer yet, but I had enough fragments to form something dangerous. I leaned back. People don't build systems like this for small players, I said. Northbridge isn't interested in Evan. He's just compatible. Frank frowned. Compatible with what? With someone who needed a clean, educated, ambitious face to front financial movement. Melissa went still. You mean he was chosen? Not chosen, I corrected. Positioned? Frank whistled softly. That's colder than I expected from a family conversation. I didn't respond because I was remembering something else now. Years ago. A compliance review I did before retirement. A layered investment structure that looked almost identical in design logic. Same delay cycles, same indirect routing, same psychological framing. Make the participant believe they are temporarily involved in something harmless. Back then I flagged it, and it disappeared. Frank must have noticed my expression. You just remembered something. Yes, I said. Melissa leaned forward. What? I hesitated, because I don't like saying things out loud when I'm not yet sure how many directions they can go. Northbridge isn't new, I said finally. Frank stopped moving. Excuse me. I've seen a version of this structure before. Melissa's voice dropped. When before I retired. That changed the air again. Frank slowly sat down. So we're dealing with recurring architecture. Yes. Melissa shook her head. But Evan didn't know anything about that. I looked at her. That's the point, I said. He doesn't need to know. He just needs to behave in a way that keeps the system stable. Frank leaned forward. And let me guess, the system starts feeding him wins before it takes anything real. I nodded. Exactly. Melissa's phone buzzed again. She looked at it and froze. It's Evan, she said. Frank sighed. Of course it is. Timing in this situation is impeccable. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me first. I nodded once. Answer. She picked up. Evan's voice came through again, but this time it wasn't confident. It was controlled. Too controlled. Melissa, he said, what did you tell him? She glanced at me. I told him I needed answers. A pause, then Evan. You should not be involved in this, Frank muttered. That's the second warning tone in under an hour. I'm starting to feel left out. Melissa tightened her grip on the phone. Evan, you're using Alaric's credentials. Do you understand how serious that is? Another pause. Then Evan said something unexpected. I didn't authorize that part. I leaned forward immediately. Frank noticed. That sounded specific. Yes, I said. Melissa frowned. What do you mean you didn't authorize it? Evan exhaled. I signed off on funding structure, not identity overlay. Frank looked at me. Identity overlay. That's a fancy way of saying someone is impersonating authority. I nodded. That was exactly what it was starting to look like. Evan continued, voice tighter now. There are compliance layers I didn't build. They were added after. Melissa whispered by who Evan didn't answer. That silence was different, not defensive, reluctant. I took the phone from Melissa. Evan, I said calmly. A pause. Dad, listen carefully, I said. This is not about saving your project. This is about understanding who has access to your financial infrastructure. Frank leaned back slightly. That's a terrifying sentence. Evan's voice lowered. You think I don't know that that was the first crack? Not guilt, awareness? I pressed gently, then explained Northbridge fully. Another pause, longer this time. Then Evan said, They found me. Melissa closed her eyes. Frank whispered, Oh no. I stayed still. Who is they? I asked. Evan hesitated. Then I don't know all of them. That answer was honest. And that made it worse. Because partial knowledge is exactly how people get trapped in systems they think they control. Frank stood up slowly. We're past startup fraud now, he said quietly. We're in network territory. Melissa looked at me. What does that mean? I answered without emotion. It means Evan isn't the endpoint, I said. He's a node. Silence filled the room again. Even the refrigerator sounded louder. Evan's voice came through one last time. Dad, just don't dig too deep. I closed my eyes briefly, because that line is never about protection. It's about exposure risk. I already am, I said. And I ended the call. Frank exhaled. Okay. So now we're officially the problem, Melissa whispered. What happens now? I looked at both of them, and for the first time since this began, I didn't frame the answer as investigation. I framed it as consequence. Now I said we find out who taught my son how to build something he doesn't fully understand. Frank nodded slowly. Good, he said. Because I was getting bored just being emotionally stressed. I prefer structured danger. And somewhere in Chicago, Evan Powell was still inside a system that had just realized someone on the outside had started reading it correctly. By the time Frank finished his second cup of coffee, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a command center pretending to be a kitchen. Screens open, notes scattered. Melissa pacing slowly like her thoughts needed physical distance to breathe. And me still sitting in the same chair but mentally no longer in Ohio. I was somewhere between transaction chains and intent analysis. Frank broke the silence first. So he said we're officially tracking your son through what appears to be a structured financial ecosystem run by unknown adults who enjoy naming things like Northbridge? Did I miss anything emotionally catastrophic? Melissa stopped pacing. That sounds about right. I didn't laugh. I was looking at something new on the screen, a metadata trail. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was consistent enough that I felt it before I fully understood it. Frank noticed my expression. You found something. Yes, I said. Melissa walked back to the table. What is it? I turned the laptop slightly. Time alignment, I said. Frank leaned in. That sounds like a sci-fi problem. In finance, I replied, it's a signature. I pointed at the transactions again. Look at the delays between transfers. 48 hours, 72 hours, always within a controlled window. Melissa frowned. Why does that matter? I leaned back. Because money doesn't naturally move like that unless someone is orchestrating liquidity timing. Frank whistled softly. So it's not just fraud. It's choreography. I nodded. Exactly. Melissa looked uneasy. Who would design something like that? I didn't answer immediately because I was already thinking about the last time I saw a structure like this. It wasn't in a startup. It was in a multi-state audit involving layered investment vehicles that never fully collapsed, just rebranded. Frank tapped the table. Okay, let's assume this is organized. What does Evan actually do in it? That was the question I had been circling since last night. I pulled up Evan's communication logs again. Then something changed. A new email thread appeared. Not from Evan, not from Melissa, from an address that had no personal identifier. Just a domain northbridge-core.net. Frank leaned forward instantly. That looks like a villain email if I've ever seen one. Melissa whispered, I've never seen that before. I opened it. The message was short. Adjust exposure window. Powell's signature is now active variable. Proceed with secondary routing. Frank blinked. I understood none of that, but I feel threatened. I didn't respond. Because my attention locked on one phrase. Powell signature. Melissa noticed my face change. What does that mean? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened a deeper log layer in Evan's archive. And there it was. My name again. Not just used, referenced, indexed, as a validation node. Frank saw it too. Okay, he said slowly. I don't like being emotionally involved in something that categorizes your father as a node. That feels disrespectful. Melissa sat down hard. So they're using you. Without you knowing, I exhaled. No, I said quietly. They're using my credibility footprint. Frank frowned. Explain that in non-nightmare language. I leaned forward. In financial systems, certain identities carry trust weight. My old consulting work created a traceable pattern of reliability. Whoever built this structure is attaching that pattern to transactions to reduce scrutiny. Melissa shook her head. So your name makes things look legitimate. Yes. Frank stared at me. That's actually brilliant and illegal. It's efficient, I corrected. A long silence followed. Outside, a truck passed again. Someone mowing a lawn again. The world continuing its denial of complexity. Melissa broke first. So Evan didn't choose this, she said. I looked at her. He chose to participate, I said carefully, but not the architecture. Frank leaned back. That's a dangerous distinction. Courts hate nuance like that. I stood up and walked to the window. I need to see something, I said. Frank stood immediately. Where are we going, Chicago? Melissa froze. What? Frank blinked. Oh, I love how casually you just escalated that into travel. I turned back. This isn't something you solve remotely anymore, I said. We need proximity. Melissa stood up too quickly. Evan will panic if you show up. That's fine, I said. I want him to panic. Frank smiled slightly. Finally. Some traditional family bonding. But I wasn't joking, because something about that email bothered me more than anything else so far. Not the content, the timing. It arrived exactly after Evan told me not to dig deeper. That wasn't coincidence. That was response logic. I grabbed my coat. Frank sighed. I'm too old for Chicago. No, I said. You're exactly the right age for Chicago. Melissa hesitated. I'm coming too. Frank immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. This is already one generation of emotional liability too many. But I looked at her. Why, I asked. She swallowed. Because I was there before he built this. I saw the shift. I know what he hid. Frank groaned. Great. Now we have eyewitness testimony. This is getting worse in the legally useful direction. I nodded once. Then you're coming, I said. Frank stared at me. You are a terrible judge of risk management. I was never in risk management, I replied. I was in detection. Frank grabbed his jacket. Same thing, just later in the process. We left the house just before noon. The drive to Columbus Airport was quiet, not peaceful, controlled, like everyone was thinking too carefully to speak. Frank finally broke it. So what exactly are we expecting to find in Chicago? I kept my eyes on the road. Behavior confirmation, I said. Melissa frowned from the back seat. What does that mean? It means I said we find out whether Evan is still making decisions or just executing them. Frank nodded slowly. And if it's the second option? I didn't answer immediately because that answer wasn't something I wanted to say out loud yet. Instead, I said, then we stop looking at him as the source. A pause, Melissa whispered, and look at what I gripped the steering wheel slightly tighter. The system that replaced him. And for the first time since 11 p.m. last night, nobody in the car spoke. Because all three of us understood the same uncomfortable truth, we were no longer trying to understand a mistake. We were trying to locate the center of something that had already learned how to hide inside people. Chicago has a way of making everything feel like it's happening faster than it should, even traffic, even conversations, even bad decisions. By the time we checked into a small hotel near the Loop, nothing fancy, just a gray building that smelled faintly like old carpet and new coffee. I could already feel the shape of this situation changing again. Frank dropped his bag on the bed and immediately sat down like gravity had personally requested his attention. I miss Ohio, he said. In Ohio, problems at least have the decency to be slow. Melissa stood near the window looking out at the city lights. I used to come here with Evan, she said quietly, when he was still normal. I opened my laptop. Normal is not a stable state, I replied. Frank pointed at me. That's the most forensic accountant sentence you've ever said. I ignored him and opened the Northbridge logs again. Something had changed. New activity, live activity. Melissa noticed my expression immediately. What is it? I turned the screen slightly. They're still moving money, I said. Frank leaned forward. While we're emotionally relocating across state lines. That's bold. I narrowed my eyes. No, I corrected. That's confident. Melissa sat down quickly. Does that mean Evan is involved right now? I checked timestamps. Then I paused. Yes, I said. Frank exhaled slowly. Okay. So either he's actively participating or being used as a live endpoint. I looked at him. That's exactly the question. Melissa rubbed her face. I don't understand how this got so big without anyone noticing. Frank laughed softly. Oh, people notice. They just noticed too late. That line hung in the room longer than it should have. I stood up. We need to see Evan, I said. Melissa looked up sharply. Now, yes? Frank groaned. Of course it's now. It's always now with you. I already had Evan's Chicago address from Melissa's earlier files. A co-working space near Fulton Market. Modern, glass-heavy. The kind of place that looks like innovation even when nothing innovative is happening. We took a rideshare. The driver didn't speak much, which I appreciated. Frank, however, did. So he said in the back seat, if this goes badly, what's the plan? There is no plan, I said. He nodded. Ah, the classic forensic improvisation strategy. Melissa looked tense. Evan might not even tell us the truth. I looked out the window at passing buildings. He will tell us what he thinks is safe, I said. Frank leaned forward. And what if safety for him means lying? I finally turned slightly. Then we stop asking questions that allow comfortable lies. Frank smiled faintly. That sounded ominous. I like it. We arrived at the building around 3:42 p.m. Glass doors, security desk, minimalist lobby that probably cost more to design than my entire house. Frank looked around. Everything here feels like it was built to impress investors who don't read anything past the first slide. Melissa didn't laugh. We took the elevator up. 7th floor. I felt something shift in my chest, not emotion exactly, anticipation. Frank noticed. You're doing that thing again. What thing? I've already seen the pattern face. I didn't respond. The doors opened, and there he was, Evan Powell. standing near a glass wall holding a phone, speaking quietly but sharply. He was wearing a dark sweater sleeve slightly rolled up like he had been working too long and didn't care who noticed. When he saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. That silence again. But this one was different. This one had recognition inside it. "Dad," he said. Frank whispered behind me. Oh, this is the part where everything becomes legally complicated. Melissa stepped forward slightly but didn't speak. Evan walked toward us slowly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I studied him, not as a father, as a pattern node. "You told me not to escalate," I said. His jaw tightened. "And you didn't listen," Frank muttered. "He really hates escalation," noted. Evan looked past me at Melissa. "You brought her here." Melissa's voice was steady but tired. "I didn't bring you anything, Evan. You already built it." That landed harder than I expected. Evan exhaled sharply. "This isn't something you understand," he said. I nodded slightly. "That's usually what people say when they don't want understanding," I replied. Frank crossed his arms. "All right, I'm going to be the neutral, emotional observer here and say this already feels like a meeting that should have had HR present." Evan ignored him. "Dad," he said again, quieter now, "you're looking at this wrong." I stepped closer, then correct me. A pause. Evan looked around the office like he was measuring invisible pressure. "They didn't start with me," he said. I nodded slowly. "I know." That surprised him. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that's not what he expected." Evan's voice lowered. "Then you understand why I can't just shut it down." I tilted my head slightly. "You mean you can't or you won't?" That question hit something. He hesitated, just long enough. Melissa stepped forward. "Evan, people are asking questions. They're using Alaric's name. Do you realize what that means?" Evan looked at her sharply. "I'm trying to contain it." Frank laughed once short and humorless. "That's what everyone says right before containment fails." Evan turned back to me. "I didn't build Northbridge," he said. "I inherited access into it." That phrase changed the shape of the room. Inherited access. Not ownership, not leadership, access. I stepped closer. "Show me," I said. Evan hesitated again, then turned his laptop toward us. And what I saw wasn't a company structure. It was a network overlay. Multiple participants, multiple entry points, and at the center a rotating identity layer. Frank leaned in. "That's not a startup." "No," I said quietly. "That's a financial relay system," Melissa whispered. "So Evan is just one part." Evan nodded slowly. "A functional layer, not the origin." I looked at him carefully. "And who is the origin?" I asked. Evan didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Because now it wasn't about ignorance, it was about fear. Finally, he said, "I don't know their full identity." Frank exhaled slowly. "We're officially in the unknown boss level phase." I closed the laptop gently. "Then we stop treating this as your problem," I said. Evan frowned. "What does that mean?" I looked at him. "It means you're not the center of this anymore?" A pause, and neither am I. Silence. For the first time, Evan looked uncertain, not defensive, not confident, uncertain. And somewhere in that uncertainty, I saw something I didn't want to admit. He wasn't lying to protect himself. He was trying to survive something he didn't fully understand. Frank spoke quietly. "So what's next?" I looked out the glass wall at Chicago, at all the moving systems beneath it. And I said, "Now we find the part of this system that thinks it's invisible, because I had a feeling we were already standing too close to it. There's a specific kind of silence that only happens when everyone in the room realizes they've stopped being observers." That's what hit us in Evan's office. Not tension, not anger, recognition of involvement. Frank was the first to move again because Frank always needs motion when reality gets uncomfortable. He walked over to the glass wall, looked down at Chicago traffic and said, "So let me get this straight. We're standing in a building where your son has functional access to something nobody fully understands, and we're pretending this is still a family issue. Evan didn't like that word, pretending. His jaw tightened. It is still a family issue. Melissa shook her head. No, Evan. That stopped being true the moment you signed things you didn't fully understand. I raised a hand slightly. Both of you are wrong, I said calmly. That got everyone's attention. Frank turned. Oh, good. Authority voice is back. I looked at Evan. This stopped being a family issue when your name stopped controlling your decisions, I said. Then I shifted my gaze slightly. And it stopped being a financial issue when my name started appearing in places I never authorized. Evan exhaled through his nose. Dad, I told you I didn't put your credentials in there. I believe you, I said. That surprised him. Melissa, too. Frank raised an eyebrow. Wait, you believe him? Yes, I said, because belief and understanding are not the same thing. I stepped closer to Evan's desk. I believe you didn't design the system, I continued, but I also believe you're inside it in a way that allows it to use you. Evan's expression tightened. That's not how it works. Frank laughed softly. Oh, that's exactly how it works. That's like saying gravity respects consent. Melissa looked between us. Then what is he inside? I paused. This was the part I'd been avoiding saying out loud. A dependency structure, I said. Frank nodded slowly. That sounds like financial quicksand. Worse, I replied, it adapts. Evan looked uncomfortable now. Not defensive, uncomfortable in the way people get when they realize they don't fully understand their own environment. That's not possible, he said quietly. I met his eyes. It is when incentives are layered correctly. Frank leaned against the desk. Translation, someone built a system that rewards participation without explaining consequences. Melissa whispered, and Evan got pulled in because, I answered honestly, because he was predictable. Evan looked up sharply. Predictable. Yes, I said. I didn't soften it. Ambitious, confident, impatient with slow capital. That profile is easy to target. That landed harder than anything else I'd said. Evan took a step back. So, I'm just a target. Frank shrugged. Welcome to adulthood. Everyone's a target. Some of us just get audited more elegantly. Melissa turned to me. So how does Northbridge actually use him? I exhaled slowly. Now, we were getting into the real structure. They don't need him to understand, I said. They need him to behave in a way that maintains liquidity flow. Frank nodded, like a human relay switch. Exactly, I said. Evan shook his head. No, I make decisions. I approve funding rounds. I negotiate terms. I looked at him. And who prepared those terms before you saw them? Silence. That silence answered everything. Frank pushed off the desk. That's the trick. You feel like you're steering, but someone already mapped the road. Melissa stepped closer to Evan. Did you ever ask where Northbridge actually operates from? Evan hesitated. That's not something they disclose, he said. Frank laughed once. That sentence alone should have been your first red flag. I watched Evan carefully. He wasn't lying, but he was compartmentalized. That's different. Evan, I said quietly, when did you first hear the name Northbridge? He looked away. Around the seed round, he said. And who introduced it, I asked. A pause, then a consultant. Frank immediately narrowed his eyes. Of course there's a consultant. Melissa frowned. Do you remember their name? Evan hesitated longer this time, then shook his head. No. They used a rotating contact system, different emails, different identities. Frank muttered, Oh, I hate organized anonymity. It's so efficient, it's offensive. I stepped back slightly. Now the pattern was clearer. Northbridge didn't present itself as an entity. It presented itself as infrastructure, invisible until used. Melissa looked overwhelmed. So what happens now? That question hung in the air. Evan looked at me. Dad, can you fix it? That was the first time he sounded less like a startup founder and more like my son, and that mattered, but not enough to change reality. I can map it, I said. Frank nodded. That's usually step one before everything becomes legally dangerous. I continued, but I can't fix something that is still being actively fed. Evan frowned. Fed? I looked at him directly. Money doesn't move itself, I said. Someone is still pushing it through the system, Melissa whispered. So there's someone above all of this. Yes, I said, Frank added quietly. And that's the part we haven't seen yet. Evan looked down at his desk. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not ambition, fatigue. I didn't want it to get this far, he said quietly. Frank shrugged. Nobody ever does. It's like potholes for consequences. Melissa placed a hand on Evan's arm, then help us stop it. Evan shook his head slightly. I don't know how much control I still have. That sentence changed the emotional weight in the room. Because control is the illusion people cling to the longest. I stepped closer. Then we find out exactly where your control ends, I said. Frank nodded, and where theirs begins. A long pause followed. Then Evan spoke again, quieter. If you go too deep into this, they'll notice. Frank smirked. Buddy, they already noticed. We showed up in Chicago. Evan looked at me. That look carried something heavier now. Concern. Not for himself. For what I was about to trigger. Dad, he said again slower. Please be careful. I held his gaze. I've been careful my entire career, I said. Then I added something I didn't expect to say. And I've never seen a structure that didn't eventually reveal its author. Frank looked at me. That sounded like a challenge. It wasn't, I said. It was a statement of probability. Melissa exhaled slowly. So what's our next move? I looked around the room, at Evan, at Melissa, at Frank. Then back to the city beyond the glass, and I said, we stop reacting to the system. A pause, and we start tracing who benefits from it existing in the first place. Because somewhere inside this structure there was still a person who believed they were invisible. And that kind of belief is always temporary. We left Evan's office at exactly 6:17 p.m. I remember the time because I checked my watch right after the elevator doors closed. Not because I needed to know it, but because my brain likes anchors when reality starts shifting too fast. Frank didn't speak until we were outside the building. Then he finally said, okay, I need to emotionally process the fact that your son is both a victim and a participant in what appears to be a structured financial ecosystem run by invisible adults with too much free time. Melissa walked slightly ahead of us, hugging herself against the Chicago wind. I don't think he's lying, she said quietly. I nodded. He isn't. Frank looked at me. That's the problem. If he were lying, this would be simple. That was exactly the problem. Simple problems have endings. Complex ones have layers. We stopped at a small coffee stand near the street. Melissa didn't order anything. Frank ordered something he didn't finish. I just stood there watching traffic move like nothing important had just changed the direction of our lives. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Frank leaned over. If that's Northbridge, I'm going to start charging emotional hazard pay. I opened it. One message. Stop pursuing structural visibility. Final warning issued. No name. No signature. Just that. Melissa saw my face change. What is it? I handed her the phone. She read it, then went pale. Frank took it next. Oh, good. We've graduated from polite warnings to corporate-sounding threats. I didn't say anything because the message wasn't what mattered. The timing was. Someone was watching the flow in real time. Frank looked at me. So what now, Alaric? I put the phone back in my pocket. Now we stop acting like we're chasing a mystery, I said. Melissa frowned. What does that mean? It means I continued. We already touched the system. Now it reacts to us. Frank exhaled slowly. Great. So we're the stimulus. Yes, I said. We walked back toward the hotel in silence. But it wasn't the same silence anymore. This one had pressure. Back in the hotel room, I opened my laptop again. Melissa sat on the bed. Frank stood by the window. Chicago lights reflected off the glass like scattered signals. I pulled up everything again, but this time I didn't focus on Evan. I filtered the system differently. I traced flow direction instead of participants, and that's when something appeared, a convergence point. Not Evan, not Melissa, not even Northbridge accounts directly. A central clearing mechanism disguised as administrative overhead. Frank leaned in. That looks like a hub. It is? I said. Melissa frowned. A hub? For what risk absorption? I replied. Frank whistled softly. That sounds like a polite way to say place where responsibility goes to die. I zoomed in further, and there it was, a recurring settlement entity, masked under rotating LLC identifiers. But the flow pattern was consistent. Money entered clean, passed through Evan's layer, then disappeared into consolidation cycles. Frank rubbed his chin. So Evan is not the source. No, I said. He's a feeder node, Melissa whispered, and my name? I paused. I checked her reference documents again. Her involvement was minimal compared to Evan's, but still present. You were collateral exposure, I said. She nodded slowly like she already knew, but needed confirmation. Frank looked at me. So where does it all end? I didn't answer immediately, because I was tracing the final convergence point. And when I found it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, recognition. This isn't just one system, I said. Frank frowned. Explain. It's replicated, I said. Melissa blinked. Replicated. I turned the screen slightly. There are multiple Northbridge-style structures operating in parallel, I said. Same architecture, different regions, different front entities. Frank slowly sat down. Oh, he said quietly. So this is bigger than Chicago. Yes, Melissa whispered. Then who built it? I hesitated, because this was the first time the answer stopped being financial and started becoming strategic. I don't think it's one person, I said. Frank frowned. A group, possibly, I said, or a system designed to survive ownership? That sentence landed heavily. Frank leaned back. So what we're dealing with is infrastructure without a face. Yes. Melissa looked overwhelmed. And Evan is just one entry point. I nodded. Frank exhaled. This keeps getting worse in increasingly professional ways. My phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. Another message. You are now mapped. Frank saw it and muttered, I miss when threats were vague and emotionally satisfying. Melissa stood up. We should leave. Go home. This is getting dangerous. I looked at her. We already left, I said. Frank nodded slowly. She's right, though. This is escalating. I closed the laptop. And for the first time since this began, I made a decision that wasn't analytical. It was procedural. We don't stop, I said. Frank frowned. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be, I replied. I looked at both of them. Because if they've mapped us, I said, then the only thing left is to map them back. Silence, Melissa whispered. And if we can't, I paused, then answered honestly, then we find out how far the system reaches, before it realizes we're no longer moving blindly inside it. Frank exhaled. Well, he said, standing up, I didn't plan on becoming part of a financial ghost story when I woke up in Ohio, but here we are. He grabbed his jacket. Melissa looked at me one last time. Evan's still your son, she said quietly. I nodded. Yes, I said. Then I added, but that's not the part of this system that worries me anymore. And as I looked at the city lights outside, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted until that moment. We were no longer trying to uncover a mistake. We were trying to expose something that didn't want to be understood. And things like that don't stay hidden forever. They adapt, or they retaliate. The message you are now mapped didn't come with a follow-up. No phone call, no second warning, no dramatic escalation, just silence. And that was somehow worse, because silence in situations like this isn't empty, it's deliberate. We checked out of the hotel at 5:42 a.m. the next morning. Frank complained about the coffee again. Melissa barely spoke, and I noticed something small but important. She kept looking over her shoulder every few minutes like she expected the system to have physical form. Frank noticed it too. She's officially in the "I think I'm being watched by invisible accountants" stage, he muttered. Melissa didn't laugh. Neither did I. We drove back through early morning Chicago traffic, the city slowly waking up like nothing had happened inside it the night before. That's the strange part about systems like this. They don't interrupt normal life. They hide inside it. Frank broke the silence. "So what's the plan, Alaric? Because map them back sounded very poetic, but I assume there's a spreadsheet involved somewhere." "There is," I said. That actually made him nod approvingly. We dropped Melissa off first. She hesitated at the curb outside a small apartment building near West Loop. She looked at me before getting out. "I didn't mean to bring you into this," she said. I shook my head slightly. "You didn't bring me in?" I replied. I was already inside. I just didn't know it yet. She looked like she wanted to say more but stopped. Instead, she just nodded once and closed the door. Frank watched her walk away. "She's going to carry that for a long time." "Yes," I said. "That's how exposure works." Then it was just me and Frank in the car. He leaned back in the seat. "So now it's just us and your son's financial horror show." I corrected him gently. "It's not his horror show anymore." Frank looked at me, meaning I kept my eyes on the road. "Meaning Evan is no longer the center of this," I said. "He's just one contact point inside a larger system that continues whether he participates or not." Frank exhaled. "That is the least comforting sentence you've said so far." I didn't respond, because I was thinking about Evan, not as a node, not as a participant, but as a man who believed he was steering something that had already decided its own direction. When I got home that afternoon, the house felt different. Not physically, structurally, like it was aware something had changed in me. Frank left after an hour, still complaining about emotional jet lag and promising to come back if the system tried anything cinematic. I didn't laugh this time. When he left, I sat alone in my kitchen. Same table, same chair, but now everything felt indexed. I opened my laptop again, and there it was, a new file. Not from Evan, not from Melissa, not from Northbridge. Just a single line of data pushed into my system logs overnight. A response. Observer identified, structural adjustment initiated. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were adjusting architecture, which meant one thing. We were no longer outside the system looking in. We were inside it looking back. And that changes everything, because systems don't fear discovery. They prepare for it. I closed the laptop slowly, and for the first time since this began, I said something out loud to an empty room. "All right," I muttered. "Now it's personal. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because I finally understood the shape of what we were dealing with. Evan wasn't the mistake, Melissa wasn't the accident, and I wasn't the exception. We were all just different entry points into something that had already learned how to exist without asking permission. And somewhere, still unknown, still unseen, something inside that system had just realized I wasn't stopping. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was chasing a story. I felt like the story had started chasing back. If there's anything this whole situation made painfully clear, it's this: most damage in life doesn't come from sudden disasters. It comes from slow participation in things you don't fully understand just because they look stable from the outside. People think control means intelligence or position or experience, but control is fragile when you're operating inside systems you didn't design. And the hardest truth I had to accept is that even love doesn't automatically protect you from being part of something dangerous, especially when silence feels easier than asking the uncomfortable questions early. I spent most of my life thinking I could read financial systems, but what I learned here is that sometimes you're not reading the system, you're inside it, being read by it. And once that happens, the only real choice left is whether you keep pretending you're safe or start looking at what's actually moving behind the numbers. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.